Hello. Welcome to one of our two connecting conversation segments for the Earth Day at 50 Teach Out. I'm Julia Maxwell. I am the current graduate fellow for Teach Outs at the Center for Academic Innovation at the University of Michigan. And I'm here with two of our experts, Kisa and Pamela, who have been contributing their expertise to the Teach Out. Kisa and Pamela, just to refresh our learners' memory, would you mind introducing yourselves for everyone?
Sure. Thanks, Julia, and hi, Kisa. I'm Pamela Reiter-Feenstra, and I'm the visiting Carillonist at the University of Michigan. I worked particularly with the Carillon students this year on a project called Global Rings, in which students brought stories and issues and folk tunes from around the world to create a more diverse and inclusive, equitable collection of music for the Carillon. So I'm eager to talk with you all and learn from each other.
Thank you for the introduction, Julia, and that was great, Pamela. My name is Kisa V. Johnson, and I am a Master of Integrated Design candidate at the Penny Stamp School for Art and Design. I'm also the DE&I manager for the University of Michigan Campus Farm, and I also study a lot in food justice, and my theme is equity and access in food systems.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here.
Thank you.
So I'm going to go ahead and start off with a question from Mia M. and Esther S. They both made really interesting connections within the Teach Out forums about both of your work and the natural world. So Kisa, you mentioned the natural world and agricultural practices of Indigenous and Black communities. And Pamela, you connect music that comes from and is inspired by the care and celebration of the natural world. So how do you see each of your own works as connected to nature and the natural world? And how do you see the natural world as a component in an equitable future?
Well, for me, I'm in food and farming, and so that it connects to everything, the environment, social systems, economic systems, technical systems. And so like I'm part of a living system, and I interact with other living systems when I'm producing food. And in how is it connected to the natural world? I think everything is grounded in food, whether it's the water, the land, how people celebrate, how they get the nourishments from their bodies. Food is a natural connection to everything.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And Pamela, what about you? Do you have any specific connections that you make to your work in the natural world, or how you see the natural world in a sustainable future?
Well, the natural world is the source of all music instruments. And when it comes to the carillon, we play on wooden keys, and that's coming from our trees. And the bells are made out of bronze, which come out of the earth. And if the earth is healthy and balanced, these resources are available to us, provided that we also protect them and prepare for those resources to be available for generations, centuries ahead of us. So that's the first way. But music can also tell stories or imitate nature. And that's what many of us try to do on our musical instruments. I mean, the ocean waves, for instance, are a marvelous example of tempo fluctuation called rubato in music. And the way the wind blows and creates whispering sounds in the leaves, that we can have that in our music too. That informs us as to what is a really natural way to express music, or bird song. And that goes on and on. Nature is just such a source of inspiration. And we in turn hope that the way I respond to viewing a flower blooming, it just with this sense of wonder, that's the kind of response that I want to offer to our listeners. In the classical music world, much of the music that's been created and composed has been Eurocentric. And while that music is beautiful and enduring, and it's something that I've dedicated a lot of my work toward, it's only part of the story. And what needs to happen now in classical music, and is long overdue, is that the music becomes representative of all cultures and all people throughout the world. So that's something that I've worked hard on and continue to, and would like to talk about more today.
Wonderful. Kisa, just to follow up with you about that, I definitely tie in some of those same tenets of thinking about food systems as Eurocentric and how to expand into a more global, sustainable food production system. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. I can speak to that because again, the very foundation of our food system in the United States, it's grounded in slavery, and it started with the system of plantation owners and moved into indentured servitude and sharecropping, and it has continued over time through agricultural exceptionalism, which has left many farm workers, out of labor protections over time, as well as a lot of our food systems people that work in grocery stores or restaurants. All the things that you're seeing now that's happening to COVID-19 to our essential workers, it's because of the basis of the racial inequities that imbalanced our system, that's still progressing today. So for me, when I look at equity, I tend to, like, nowadays when I think about equity, I think about it from a place of agency. I typically like to design in spaces or work on projects that give not only myself a sense of agency, but other people. So that means when you're thinking about agency, you're thinking about power and you're thinking about healing that's involved. And with equity, you have to pull back those many layers, especially how Pamela was saying that, like, all these voices haven't been heard. The real stories haven't been heard. So if we are to create a different scenario, we do have to have some self-reflection and come to terms with the awful history that's been upon us day by day. It's like the elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about the deep racial inequities, and it does start with the food in the land.
Mm-hmm. That's a really great segue, sort of thinking about how we move forward by looking at the past and looking at the conflicts of the past and the healing we need to do from the past. So I wonder, one of the learners, Lizette F., reflected that there's a big emphasis on healing in both of your work. So how do you see sustainability as a practice of healing and looking at past wrongs done to communities of people and the natural world itself? How do you kind of rectify that in your own work and your own perspectives as to what the future holds?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up with what Kisa said, as well
Sure.
as your question,
Yeah.
because I really resonate with what she's saying about agency.
Yeah.
And so I've been creating pieces. I've interviewed some of my African American friends about their experience with prejudice and racism, because I think these stories need to be out there, and I think white people have to be activated in these stories as well, to promote and create change throughout every group and culture of people. And so some of the pieces I've composed have been directly telling these stories of prejudicial racial treatment of people. And at the same time, I also want to represent people of agency. So for instance, this past year, Toni Morrison died. And she's a phenomenal author that really revolutionized fiction writing for every writer. And the way she tells stories and the way her characters unravel, it's absolutely riveting. They stay with me. And I think she's just such an important author. So I took her Nobel Peace Prize speech, and it opens with, "Once upon a time, there was an old woman, blind but wise." And packed into that familiar sing-songy start to a story, she adds 3 words, blind but wise. And then her story unfolds from that. And it's incredible. And through her characters, she's talking about agency, and she's talking about prejudice and stereotypes and conditions, but it's all done in an art form. So I took her speech, and she's such a source of inspiration for me. And I started creating a piece based on the rhythm. Once upon a time, there was an old woman, blind but wise. So I started creating kind of this jazz piece based on her words. And that's a piece of agency. That's an example, I think, of lifting up the great voices among us who deserve to be heard now and long into the future.
Mm-hmm. So as we continue to reflect on healing and the looking backward at the past wrongs that have been done to communities and people and the natural world, and how we need to use that to look forward. So one of our learners talked about Lizette F. is her name. She reflected on the emphasis of healing in both of your works. So how do you see sustainability as a practice of healing, both in the moment, healing the past, and healing wounds done to communities and also to the earth itself? How do you look at your work as a practice of healing, and how do you look at sustainability as a practice of healing?
Well, for me, I always ask everyone, what do they mean by the word sustainability? Because what are we sustaining?
Mm-hmm.
We live in a very broken system, and you can tell by how things are all breaking down here with the COVID-19, especially when it comes to the food system. Like, all systems are breaking down, but I'll concentrate more on like the food system from the lens that I'm looking from. And as a designer, I'm looking at it from a design perspective. So when I speak, I'm speaking of, I'm asking questions not only of myself, but other people. And then I talk about, okay, so what do we do with that? And so when it comes to the word sustainability, there's a huge disconnect between sustainability and social justice. And until we start having those conversations, because I really can't see one without the other, there's no separateness, there's no disconnect, because the disconnect has consequences. You know, our understanding of the connections between justice and sustainability, it shapes the work that we do in the food system, and it determines like our chances of making real progress if we don't deal with that. And so from a designer lens, for me, I always tend to look at the scenario that I'm working with. And then there's that history and healing that has to happen before the agency takes place. And then you got to acknowledge and start dismantling the power constructs that's around you. And then you go into like these iterations of ideation. Like, you really have to talk about these very serious, complex issues, because the problem that we're having dealing with these complex issues, these wicked problems, these design X problems, they're so complex, and everybody is kind of looking for simple answers instead of doing the work. And the work comes through the healing. The history and the healing.
Yes. So what Kisa just said, again, really resonates, that the first step is to get into the hard work. And that means leaning into discomfort. It means talking about things most people have avoided. Because if those conversations can't happen, then change can't happen as well. So that's, I mean, I'm really grateful for the conversation we have right now. And then healing comes from owning the wrongs and making active plans and following up with action and sustained action that says over time, that to right those wrongs and to heal that. So I learned the word sustainment from Kisa last week. And so I'm like, hey, Google, what's the difference between sustainability and sustainment? And sustainment is the act, it's the action of sustaining. Sustainability means that there's potential to sustain, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the action is occurring. So I'm grateful to Kisa for teaching me that. And,
Thank you.
and then if I could just follow up on healing, there's also been a very long tradition of documenting the healing powers of music.
Mm-hmm.
And this goes back to very ancient times. There are documents, well, for instance, the story of the psalmist David soothing the angry King Saul by playing his harp. And this predates the Common Era, right? It's before the Common Era. But we still have that capacity today. And one of the Wallace Fellows, who's a journalist here, or she's a Dutch journalist, but she came here to the University of Michigan, saw these carillons and said, may I take lessons? She has now been reading about the carillon and the history of the carillon. So bells were invented in China, but they were taken over by Europeans who started building bell towers and creating all this European music for the bells. But China hasn't had a lot of recognition for that invention of the bell, first off. But in addition to that, early on in Europe, when the Black Plague occurred, people believed that the bells would help to ward off the disease. So clergy and healthcare workers who were going to treat the sick would wear bells, and they would shake bells in front of them to try to ward off these diseases. Well, Jet Schouten, this Dutch journalist who was studying here at the University of Michigan, read about that. She wanted to figure out everything about the carillon. And she said, well, what if we were to do something healing connected to COVID-19? And she suggested this Ukrainian folk song that actually became very popular when Ukrainians faced sniper gunfire in 2014. And that became one of their songs of solidarity. She said, this would sound great on the carillon. Can you do something with it? So I arranged it, and I created these viral spirals where you move your hands in circles like this to play on the carillon. And eventually the bells start kicking away the particles of the virus. And we've created a piece called Healing Bells. And so that's, I guess, just one example of how music can be used toward healing.
Wonderful.
I know for us, thank you so much for sharing that, because I am currently facilitating an online equity challenge in around racial equity in food systems. And one of our challenges was to create a collage of a discussion that we went through. And I gave an open-ended assignment where people can share a song, or they could share an image, or they could share a poem, they can write something down. And it was quite hard for some to even participate because they were so used to like writing that other forms of expression. But it was other people who like shared songs, and then they were excited about sharing the music because it meant something to them. And you know how they were digesting the content, they used that. They did a correlation of like, wow, this meant this in the song and it means this, you know, here. So that was a beautiful example, Pamela, of healing.
Thank you, Kisa.
Yeah.
That's it's really funny how you both keep turning the conversation towards just naturally towards the topic that I want to cover next. And the next thing that I wanted to ask you about is creativity, which factors beautifully into what we were just talking about. So we were just discussing how healing can take many forms, and one of those forms is by creating art or manifesting our feelings about certain conflicts or situations through artistic expression. So both of you have a little bit of, or more than a little bit of a history with creativity in your work. So I was wondering, and a couple learners, sorry, I'm going to start that over. So both of you in your videos talk about how creativity factors into your work, and learners definitely picked up on that as well, and how they thought about creativity in their own work and in sustainability practice throughout the global community and the teach out. So, so I guess one question that I kind of pulled from those learner responses is, what role do you see creativity playing in your practice? And can you give any advice to learners who would like to incorporate creativity into their sustainability practice and their ideas of looking at the past and the future, and healing from some of these things that we've been talking about?
In the Carillon studio, we have students who have studied music before, but many of them are computer science, engineering, biomolecular science, LS&A majors. And we are talking about this on a regular basis. So they are coming both with their own heritage and with their travels or internships. And that is feeding their ability to have creativity. So I worked with my students to teach them how to compose new works for the Carillon. One student had traveled to Nicaragua, and while she was there, she happened upon a Nicaraguan holiday that she didn't know existed. And she was so touched by witnessing this and hearing the people sing. So when she got back, she researched what they had been singing and then brought those tunes to her composition for the Carillon. So now we have a new piece, thanks to her internship, that it will be in our Global Rings collection. Yeah. And other students who are working on sustainment in terms of energy choices for the future brought that into their research, and that brought them back to First People or Native Americans who made the long-term choices of living in harmony with the earth, so that they're practicing sustainment in everything they did. So they brought then Swinomish tunes. We have Chippewa tunes, which are also Ojibwe connected, and these voices are being represented. We have this collection now that we've made called Global Rings, and this is this collection of pieces from all over the world that the students put together. Then we also had these 3 Wallace Fellow journalists asked to join this endeavor. And not all of them have ever read music before, but they came and they are fantastic storytellers. And they had these pressing stories that had to be told, but that they haven't been able to tell in print, either because in the case of Venezuela, the government is corrupt and oppressive and is practicing censorship of anything that might cast the government in a poor light. And so this was Marielba Nunez from Venezuela who brought us Llanto de Pollas, which is featured on the video, but she also brought another piece, or which is now a piece. It was a story called La Boca del Dragón about some people who were seeking asylum from Venezuela and were escaping at night from this bay called the Mouth of the Dragon and disappeared. And most of the people on those 2 small boats were young women. So it's human trafficking is suspected. So we created a piece that will be given to the families of these missing women, because they have had no kind of support from the government. In fact, any journalists who tried to pursue that received anonymous threats. And so they are suffering in silence. And this was a way through the arts to give them a voice. And I'll tell one other story, and that is, there's a journalist here, Kwon Young Shin, who is from South Korea, and he covered the story, the very tragic story of the Seawall ferry sinking. and there was an entire class of high school students on this ferry, and they were told to stay in their cabins under deck, and the captain and crew abandoned ship and watched the ship sink with all of those 250 high school students inside, and they all drowned. And again, there was a lot of political maneuvering around that after the tragedy. And so that he felt as if the families of those victims, of the high school students, who happened to be at the exact same age as my son, so this hit me really hard, need to have something given to them that shows people care, and people are hearing them and are standing beside them in their grief. And so we are right now in the process of creating what we're calling Seawall Lament. It's the name of the ferry, and it's a lament that will conclude with a lullaby to symbolize these families holding their beloved children in their arms, which they never got to do before their lives were cut short.
Kisa, do you have any thoughts about creativity in your own work and how that plays into the way you think about sustainability?
Yeah, see, I probably look at creativity a bit now. I'm sure it's the same, it's countless, but for me, it's like the removal of the interference of the thinking in the mind. Like when you're in like this flow where like you're concentrating, you're focused, it's a sense of ecstasy. It's this like great inner clarity that comes. It's knowing that you can do it and you want to do it over and over, and it's like extreme intrinsic motivation. And I tend to, that's the one thing where I wanted to go into farming, because I wanted to work with people who actually loved what they were doing. Like nobody was telling them to come there. It was more like they were like, we're self-organized. It was like a self-organized system where people come because this is what they love to do. They may be a computer science major, but they come to the farm because they love being there. They love how they feel when they're there. They love how they feel when they leave, or they like doing the things that they do. And so to me, when it comes to creativity, there's a huge sense of love that we tend to not want to talk about a lot. And so with my work, I think it's extremely creative, because we always have to like not just rely on ourselves, but we have to rely on the soil, the air, the climate, the plant. We're trying to figure things out on how to make it grow, how to prevent disease from happening. And with that, I take that type of creativity when I'm doing online equity challenges. I've been doing at least done 3 this year, whether they were face-to-face and now they're online. And so I tend to like to have people to not feel like they're in oppressive spaces, because we are. And so I like when people come as they are, where they can actually heal and be open and be themselves. And so I like to do a lot of open activities where it's not focused on one type of form of expression, that there's various forms of expression. Like the example when we were trying to do a collage together, coming from a discussion. And instead of just talking about it, I asked people to contribute a quote, image, a song, a poem, or they can write as well. Another activity that we're doing, we're trying to measure social capital. Well, create social capital between both of our groups. And so we had an assignment where you had to take some time to either do a video call or a phone call, or you can text and you find out more about that person. And like, why they like working here? What are they doing? How are they feeling? And then we'll come up with several ideas of projects that we can come together, and then we'll all bring it to the group. So there's some action happening. And so I wouldn't be able to do any of that without the curiosity of other people, without imagination, and definitely we're not without creativity. Like we need that.
Wonderful. All right, well, we've reached the end of our Connecting Conversations piece today. Thank you so much, Kisa and Pamela, for being here. It was wonderful to have you both chat together and with me, and I feel like I, along with the learners, learned so much from both of you. So thank you so much. Learners, thank you so much for being involved in the Teach Out. Thank you for being here. We appreciate you so much, and we hope you continue to enjoy the Earth Day at 50 Teach Out.